So, when the news first broke about these latest India-Pakistan events, it really felt like, the usual kind of back and forth we've seen before. But then as you start digging through the different accounts, you realize, wait a minute, there's actually a much deeper story here. It's not just surface level claims about who won or who struck first.
Absolutely. That's right. What actually unfolded was a really quite intricate series of actions. And there was very deliberate messaging coming from both India and Pakistan. And, some really significant strategic implications, too, that go way beyond just the immediate fighting.
Yeah.
Our aim here isn't really to get lost in, let's say, speculation or propaganda, because there's always plenty of that. It's more to kind of pinpoint the crucial bits of information and really try to understand the narratives, the stories that were being presented to us.
Right. We definitely have a lot to unpack here. We've looked at, statements from the prime ministers, from military officials, international reactions, even some, well, interesting things happening on social media. So where do we even start to make sense of it all? I suppose let's begin with what seemed to be the trigger point, Operation Sindoor.
Okay, yeah, Operation Sindoor. It certainly looks like it was India's direct response to that awful terrorist attack in Pahalgam, which happened on the night of May 7th going into the 8th. What's really notable, I think, is the speed and the very specific nature of India's reaction. It wasn't just a general condemnation. It was a very fast, very focused military operation.
Right. And India claimed they hit 9 specific terrorist infrastructure sites. And this is, I think, a really key point, not just across the line of control, the Lassi in Kashmir,
Hmm.
but also across the actual international border. They named places like Bahawalpur and Murike inside Pakistan proper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were specific about the groups, too, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. And that feels like a really significant shift, doesn't it? By hitting targets inside Pakistan itself, beyond the disputed territory, India seemed to be drawing a new red line,
Hmm.
basically signaling that these groups, their facilities, they wouldn't be considered safe anymore, even deep inside Pakistan.
That's a huge step.
It is. It's a very assertive stance. It could signal a real change in India's maybe strategic patience,
Yeah.
potentially leading to more direct action like this if there are future attacks. It definitely forces Pakistan to rethink its strategy if, they're using non-state actors.
And the initial messages coming out of India, they were also very, very careful, weren't they? They kept stressing that the strikes were only against terror elements, their infrastructure, making it clear. No military targets, no civilian areas.
That's absolutely crucial for understanding how India tried to frame this. They wanted to project it as a clean surgical counterterrorism operation, trying, I suppose, to limit the chances of things escalating further by being really clear about their limited aims.
And then there was that press briefing. That was quite something. You had Colonel Sophia Qureshi and Wing Commander Vyomika Singh leading it, emphasizing it was a joint op Army, Navy, Air Force. Plus, the name itself, Sindoor, referencing the widows from the Pahalgam attack, and having 2 senior women officers from different religious backgrounds presenting it all. That definitely sent a message.
It was a very powerful image, yeah.
Yeah.
And a clear attempt, I think, to contrast India's values, or what they wanted to project as their values, against the terrorists.
Yeah.
The briefing also went into specifics about the camps. They mentioned, for instance, Markaz Taiba in Muridke.
The 2611 Mumbai attacks link, infamous.
Exactly. And Markaz Subhanallah in Bahawalpur, which is known as the Jaish-e-Mohammed headquarters.
And India didn't just, say this happened. They presented what they claimed was evidence, satellite pictures, timelines of attacks, trying to back up this idea of precision strikes hitting actual terror infrastructure. I think there was even a Sky News report that looked into the Muridki site, wasn't there? Finding social media activity supporting terror groups right there, even though Pakistan kept denying any camps existed.
Yeah, that external reporting adds another layer. And it's interesting, isn't it, how India presented this detailed sort of evidence package compared to Pakistan's immediate reaction, which took a very different form.
Very different. Pakistan's first move seemed to be heavy artillery shelling along the Law-Ki-Sai. We heard reports from Tangdar, Baramulla, Uri, Poonch. And tragically, that resulted in civilian casualties, which seemed, well, completely at odds with India's claim of only hitting terror targets.
It certainly did seem to contradict that narrative. While India was trying to project precision, Pakistan's response, at least initially with the shelling, felt more indiscriminate. Alongside that, Pakistan also claimed, that they'd repelled Indian attacks and inflicted damage, although the specifics there were a bit murky at first.
And then came the really big disputed claims. Pakistan saying they had shot down multiple Indian fighter jets, Rafales, Su-30s, even a MiG-29.
Ah, yes.
That really kicked off a storm, but it was met with a lot of skepticism, right? Especially because the information seemed conflicting and there wasn't really any solid proof presented about the planes or the pilots.
The information war just exploded at that point, didn't it? While Pakistan was making these pretty bold claims about air victories, they were also flat out denying there were any terrorist camps on their soil, painting themselves purely as a victim of terrorism.
Which is fascinating when you remember that statement by their own defense minister, Khawaja Asif, who had, not that long ago, actually acknowledged Pakistan's past support for some of these very groups.
Yeah, it's a stark contradiction. You have the current denial alongside that past admission.
Really is. And while they were pushing this victim narrative, we also had reports and even some video evidence, apparently, of Pakistani drones flying into Indian airspace, not just near the border in places like Srinagar and Jammu, but reportedly much deeper towards Ludhiana, even Gujarat.
Hmm. That drone activity, yeah, it suggests something more than just defense. Maybe reconnaissance,
Mm.
or maybe even attempts at attacks. India, for its part, said it was using countermeasures, both kinetic methods, basically shooting them down, and non-kinetic, like electronic jamming.
Right.
Plus, their air defense systems, things like Barak, the S-400, Akash, were presumably active.
Yeah.
These systems cover different ranges, Barak for closer threats, S-400 for longer range ones.
And the situation apparently got even more intense on the fourth night after Operation Sindoor. Reports suggested Pakistan sent a huge number, like over 300 drones,
Yeah, there was a figure reported.
trying to target military airports and installations, Odagar, Awantipura, Udhampur, Pathankot, Patinda. And there were even accusations that Pakistan was hitting civilian infrastructure, like schools and hospitals. India definitely highlighted those claims.
Those alleged attacks on civilian sites, if true, would obviously be a major, major escalation and very worrying. But interestingly, even with all this reported activity, the drones, the attempted strikes, Pakistan was apparently still maintaining that it was observing a ceasefire at the LoSec.
Which just doesn't seem to add up, does it? Drones flying deep, alleged attacks on bases, but claiming ceasefire?
It seems inconsistent, to say the least.
Okay, this brings us to maybe the most sensitive part of this whole thing, the nuclear angle. Prime Minister Modi made that statement about India not tolerating any nuclear blackmail. That got everyone's attention.
It certainly did. That statement was very significant. And after India strikes, there was naturally speculation, were any of those targets near Pakistani nuclear sites? Tirana Hills was mentioned. But it's important to note both Indian and Pakistani military officials publicly denied that any nuclear installations were targeted or hit.
Okay, denied.
Yeah.
But the possibility of a nuclear threat from Pakistan, maybe if they felt their conventional forces had taken a really big hit, that seemed to be hanging in the air. And this is where the U.S. involvement gets, well, quite interesting. You had Donald Trump initially claiming he'd brokered a ceasefire.
Right, which India pretty quickly downplayed, didn't they?
They did. It seemed maybe premature, looking at how things actually played out.
Yeah. And what happened next was perhaps even more telling. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who first said, this conflict was fundamentally none of our business, then reportedly got on a direct call with PM Modi. And the reason given was some kind of alarming intelligence.
Right, this alarming intelligence. What was that about? There's this theory, or speculation at least, that it might have been linked to how close some of India's streaks got to Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division headquarters. The command responsible for their nuclear weapons.
That's the theory, yes. If India's actions, even unintentionally, were perceived as getting too close to Pakistan's nuclear command or assets, well, that would absolutely trigger major international alarm bells, especially in Washington.
It raises that whole question about Pakistan's nuclear red lines. General Khalid Kidwai laid them out years ago, didn't he? Things like,
Yeah, the main ones were India seizing large parts of Pakistani territory, destroying a large part of Pakistan's armed forces, economic strangulation, or causing large-scale internal political destabilization.
So the big question is, did India's actions during Operation Sindoor get interpreted, either by Pakistan or maybe by the U.S., as getting close to crossing one of those lines?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Sure.
And probably what that alarming intelligence was related to. It's such a delicate, dangerous balance.
It really is. And alongside the military stuff, both sides were locked in this incredibly intense information war. You saw it all over social media, news outlets, just flooded with claims, counterclaims, propaganda.
Oh, absolutely fierce.
Sometimes with, frankly, very little basis in reality.
Yeah.
And the danger with that kind of stuff is how easily it exploits existing biases, right? makes it crucial for you, as someone watching this unfold, to really question the sources you're seeing.
Definitely. The info war was intense. We saw all sorts of examples, totally baseless claims about, Indian forces capturing Islamabad or people using old photos or videos from completely different conflicts to show supposed damage. That kind of mis and disinformation, it just fuels the fire and makes it so much harder to figure out what's actually going on.
Yeah, and some international observers actually raise concerns about the credibility of some of the Indian media coverage, too. Accusations of maybe sensationalism or reporting unverified claims too quickly.
That's a really critical point. In any conflict like this, having accurate, responsible reporting is just vital. It wasn't just one side, of course. Pakistan definitely tried hard to spin the events as a victory for them,
Yeah.
using the information space to try and, boost their own narrative.
While India, meanwhile, was pushing its narrative very hard too, framing it as a decisive, necessary action against terrorism, really trying to highlight those links between Pakistan and the terror groups on the world stage.
Hmm. And the whole debate over who actually won the narrative battle this time. It's interesting, especially if you compare it to past incidents, like after the Balakit strikes.
Did India do better this time?
Well, India seemed perhaps more prepared, more proactive in getting its evidence and its framing out there quickly. But, that said, some reports noted that Pakistan's narrative, even though it often lacked concrete evidence for its bigger claims, still seemed to get some traction in parts of the international media. Narratives can be powerful, even without strong proof, if they tap into existing viewpoints.
So, stepping back and looking ahead, what are the bigger strategic takeaways here? It really feels like India might have shifted its whole approach to dealing with Pakistan-based terror. More assertive, maybe, more direct.
I think that's probably the key takeaway, yeah. That shift from relying mainly on diplomacy or maybe limited surgical strikes just across the Law Sea to these cross-border incursions, especially hitting targets across the international border. It does suggest India might be willing to take stronger action now to raise the potential cost for Pakistan.
Yeah, changes the calculation.
It could certainly impact Pakistan's strategic thinking and maybe its reliance on allies like China, too.
And what about international pressure? The U.S. getting involved, financial bodies like the IMF, does that play a big role in what Pakistan does next? Although, the IMF still gave them that loan, didn't they, despite India's concerns?
It did, which just highlights how complex these geopolitical situations are. There are always multiple factors at play, but the tension, it's undeniable, it's still there. And the risk of future conflict is real, especially if Pakistan doesn't or can't verifiably shut down terrorist activities from its territory.
India's message seems pretty clear. Terror and talks don't mix, or terror and trade.
Exactly. That seems to be the firm line. Essentially, India looks like it's trying to increase the deterrence cost for Pakistan, making the consequences of supporting or tolerating terrorism so high that it's just not worth it anymore.
And we shouldn't forget the economic side either. Conflict, even just heightened tension, costs money for both sides.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even though India's economy is much larger, any sustained conflict has repercussions.
We even saw the IPL, the huge cricket league, get suspended because of the security situation. That shows how these things ripple outwards.
It really does. And ultimately, I think what all this underscores is just how vital it is for everyone, us, you listening, to try and sift fact from propaganda and the absolute need for responsible reporting.
Okay, so just to quickly recap, we've seen what looks like a pretty significant change in India's strategy towards cross-border terror, a really fierce, often misleading information war, those underlying nuclear worries that brought in the U.S., and now a ceasefire that, well, feels maybe more like a pause than a real resolution. It's definitely a situation with way more layers than those first headlines suggested.
Couldn't agree more. Moving past simple ideas of, who won't or lost, it's crystal clear that these events have some major long-term implications for the India-Pakistan relationship, obviously, but also for stability across the whole region.
And maybe that leads us to a final thought, something for you to ponder. When you consider all these different narratives we've talked about and the strategic shifts, what do you think might be the most significant long-term impact of these events? How is this likely to shape India-Pakistan relations and regional stability down the road? And maybe, what should everyone be focusing on now? Definitely something to think about.